wrestling is the core foundation for how you move around.
Mm-hmm.
Everything uses wrestling mechanics. And then on top of that, you have swordsmanship, which swordsmanship is not necessarily something that would be the primary battlefield art. It's more of like a fallback. It's kind of like a sidearm. But the longsword is particularly useful in that you can kind of learn the mechanics for several weapons at the same time, because we'll say longsword has the most in common with every other weapon. It kind of sits in the middle. And then poleaxe is the most heavily focused on polearm. There is a little bit of spear stuff, but it's quite simplified compared to something like poleaxe, since it primarily deals with thrusts. There's a lot of technical aspects to it, but it has a lot more to do with like range and distance and like judging what your opponent's going to do. There's not a huge variety of techniques compared to the other weapons. And then there are things like Longest Messer, which is a little bit of a later addition, but it's one of my favorites. It's very similar to Sword and Buckler, except you have an offhand instead of a buckler, which is interesting because it gives you a lot of grappling techniques, but it leaves your offhand vulnerable if you try to initiate those grappling techniques from the wrong range. And then, so normally you'd be able to just stuff their, kind of like in boxing, you know how you can like stuff the hand, like with your jab or whatever, you can do like the pawing jabs. You can do those kinds of actions carefully and at the right moment with your buckler and just pin their sword arm to their body. And then from there, you're free to like move around and attack them. I mean, they'll still have their buckler out, but it's a little bit easier if someone's arm is like pinned across their body. It's very hard to get out of that without basically moving dramatically. So, and then the other main one is Rondel dagger, which is actually, I can get a dagger real quick, or a training dagger to show you, just because they are. Here we go. So these are the plastic ones, which we were using wooden ones. There's a video I have of that, but even through the masks, if you get hit in the head with the wooden one, it will slosh your brain around. It's not good. These are flexible enough. You can see like the point bends, but down here it's quite rigid, which makes it nice. So like if someone has this, you can still turn the dagger out and use a lot more of the historical techniques. So these are actually like $12, and they're made by Cold Steel. And I don't know what prompted them, but to make these, but they've been sold out pretty much since. Like they're only in stock occasionally.
Wow.
It's like, they like. I think everybody's just like, these are amazing. And I'm not a huge fan of a lot of Cold Steel's other stuff, but those plastic training daggers or nylon or polycarbonate or whatever they are, they're fantastic.
Wow.
So
maybe I'll buy some too. Cold Steel training daggers. I wonder if they have it on Amazon. I bet you they do. Yeah,
that's where I got it.
Nice. Yeah, I see it right now.
Yeah, it's like $12 Canadian.
Wow. That's pretty cool, man. Okay, so we've done some Hema videos and stuff on Fight Commentary, and there's tons of Hema videos. What do you think are some just common misconceptions of Hema?
I can tell you, I think my perspective on it as a teacher is probably a little different than most other people's, but I think it's kind of useful to just break down how weapons-based combat kind of works from like the experiential level, right? So a lot of times people are like, oh, okay, what do you have to do in order to win a fight with a weapon? And it's like, oh, I just have to hit my opponent. It's like, okay, if you give, say, two 12-year-olds sticks, or say a sword, if you give two completely untrained people swords and just say, okay, just hit each other, they'll both hit each other, guaranteed, right? And both of them are going to be completely sliced up. And it's like, so hitting your opponent is really not the primary goal. Like, that's not the primary display of what good swordsmanship is. It's primarily about being able to defend yourself from your opponent's attacks, and then, while controlling your opponent's blade, being able to simultaneously attack. So there's not a strong distinction, at least in the paradigm of the German masters that I study. There's not a strong distinction between like defend and then attack kind of a thing. They happen simultaneously. So it's like, as somebody attacks you, you have to basically gain control over their weapon as you're launching your counterattack. And this makes it very challenging in a lot of ways, just because people are really, it can be very difficult to figure out where somebody is going to attack from, especially so with novice people. They kind of break down into two groups. The one type of novice will just try to attack you without any regard for themselves whatsoever, and that leads to what we call doubles, which is widely considered to be the bane of Hema in general. It's just where both people hit each other. That is essentially it's widely considered the worst outcome, just because neither person has been. It's like a conversation where two people just yell at each other. There's not really any exchange. So we want to avoid that, but the other half of novices will just do defense. So instead of having a combined offense and defense, they'll do a lot of blocking like this, and it just leaves them open. And so what ends up happening is the people who are overly defensive just end up going, and then eventually, the person who, if you just have like a moderate amount of aggression, you'll just hit them. Like, it doesn't require a ton of skill other than the ability to execute very, very fundamental cuts and thrusts. Like, just execute fundamental attacks. They're so paranoid about getting hit that they won't ever attack you back. So that's one of the biggest things. And the other thing, this used to be a lot more of a problem, but people had this idea that, swords were much heavier than they were, and that, you have to like swing with all of your might and all of this kind of stuff. So a lot of the way that I explain swinging a sword is it's very similar to like casting a fishing rod. Where like you're not doing it with all of your might and trying to slam it. All it's gonna do is slam your line straight into the water in front of you, or like if you're on the land, into the ground. So it's a lot more about being relaxed and then also being sensitive, so you can feel what your opponent is doing and then react to that. There's actually a historical term for people who like do the barbarian swings. They call them buffel, which means buffalo. And yeah, they're not highly regarded as skillful fencers. They're usually we're told that it's like, well, pretty much provoke them to attack with some sort of a feint, wait for them to swing past, and then use this a concept called Nachreisen, which means following after. It's just, you wait for them to swing for the fences, and then you hit them on the same line that they just passed you on. So by basically over swinging, you create a massive opening all here. So you can use your sword to just cut off that line and attack them simultaneously.
Wow. I think one of the reasons why people think of swinging swords like that kind of like the buffalo swing is because a lot of times how it's portrayed in Hollywood, like you can tell the actors are like, and they're doing it for the camera because the camera needs to pick up big movements. But I love that imagery you gave us of it's like casting a fishing. You know, I'm not good at fishing. I've tried it a few times, but I know that motion you're talking about. You know, it's not like
Well, and the masters tell us, like in the manuscripts, they tell us, imagine that your point is basically attached by a rope, and that rope is pulling the point directly to your target. That's how you're supposed to cut. I would say now, think of it like there's a bungee cord and you're like holding it back, and when you do your cut, you just let it go forward. But I find the fishing rod metaphor tends to work a lot better for people. They tend to just, people, almost everyone, I think, or most people have gone fishing before, or at least tried to cast at least once. So they get a feel for it, and it just has that right kind of, the right kind of feel. So if you can apply that to swordsmanship, which that's a lot easier said than done, like you get freaked out when you're in free play and you tense up, and that's like the first 6 to 9 months of most people's experience. But eventually you can learn to relax and just let the sword do a lot more of the work for you. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to add on to the conversation is that one of the most popular Hema videos on Fight Commentary was when we looked at this like Hema versus Kung Fu thing in Australia. And the Hema people won because they literally were just spamming attacks, not defending. And it's like a lot of the comments were like, dude, this is such a bad representation of Hema. This is such a bad representation of weapons play in general. Like the only reason the Hema guys won was because they just spammed attacks in the way those suits did. When it recorded that first hit, the person lost. So, like, of course the Hema guy would win if he's just spamming attacks, but that's not representative of how a real kind of, like, weapons match would work.
Yeah, that brings up a really important point, actually, and that is the rule set really, really defines how people are going to fence, right? So, in that case, I think you nailed it. Like, number one, they're using blunt polycarbonate weapons, which they're clubs. They do not behave like a sword. Like steel on steel has a very specific feel to it, right? And it's like the thin, if you push on the side of a sword, it's going to bend. Like they're flexible. I'll show you. Like it doesn't even take that much force really to get it to bend, right? And you can have stiffer blades, obviously, and those are generally more dangerous for training weapons because the stiffer the blade, the more it's actually going to drive into the person. But even a stiff blade does flex, and it has give on one of those directions. Whereas if you're pushing into the edge of it, it has the entire width of the blade behind it. So in this direction, it's that thick, right? It's a piece of steel that's that thick in that direction. Yeah. So and I've fenced with synthetics or, polycarbonate swords and stuff, and I find them to be fairly counterproductive to a lot of the historical technique. Number one, they're exceptionally slippery, right? So steel actually has like a very specific kind of feel to it, like and sharp edges actually bite into each other quite aggressively. So it's hard, like if you get edge into edge, they'll lock. But if you get like even just your edge into the flat and you're moving against it, it's not as slippery as you would think. It has a very, very specific feel, and if you're using the synthetic ones, you lose a lot of that. Or if you use like wooden training swords, I would say if you've practiced sufficiently with the steel swords, so we call the steel swords like Featherschwert, but which means feather sword. It's kind of a modern term applied, like a neologism. But if you've practiced with the steel sword sufficiently, you can then apply it with the synthetics. But I find, especially in bind work, so when your blade is touching your opponent's blade, it's very, very difficult to develop that without training with the steel swords. And like you were saying with the rule set, the person who basically gets hit with the crippling wound first, they are the one who ends up losing. And so on top of it, you also have to be hitting these things with a club sufficiently hard to set off the sensor where it's like, okay, well, I don't know about you, but the last time I, cut something with a knife in the kitchen, I didn't have to swing for the fences. You know what I'm saying? Like sharp tools, sharp implements are designed to cut with the minimal amount of force required. Like I don't have to like give it like a baseball bat swing. But so with the combination of you have to hit really hard and you're using the polycarbonate weapons combined with just kind of like the general format, like if you hit the other opponent first, it's a lot more like Olympic fencing in that regards. It tends to lead to that thing. And I think the advantage for the Hema guys was, well, a lot of the older rule sets were very similar to that. And so they're used to it. Like they've already practiced for it. And it's like, oh, it's like the guy who was using the quarterstaff or the bow staff, he was using it like a really wide grip longsword and just doing what we call cutting around, right? He was just like wasn't engaging with the opponent's blade, was just cutting to each quarter of the opponent's body over and over again and sneaking in the occasional thrust. And it's like, that's like really fundamental kind of like longsword offense. And I think I watched that video recently and he's like, oh, this is my first day using this. Like, well, like practicing for the rule set really shapes your how you perform the art or how you fight. And so as a result, well, as I said, that's a lot of how the older rule systems tended to work, and then a lot more of the recent rule systems, they've kind of started to focus a lot more around being able to hit the opponent without getting hit. So, and a lot of times you'll, if you hit the opponent, you either get a certain amount of points, or I think more interestingly, like they get a penalty, right? Like they lose points, right? So it's like counting down. And if they hit you with what's called an afterblow, right? If they hit you as you're you hit them and then you just stop fencing and they smack you, a lot of times it will mitigate almost all of your points or all of your points. So the more recent rule sets have been highly punishing towards that kind of thing. There's a little bit of a difficulty of figuring out how to balance this all out. Because incidental, like sometimes you have two people who are fencing well, but what ends up happening is you, like for instance, someone does a feint and the other person also does a feint, and then they both are like, oh, the other guy's committed, and then you both attack to where you see an opening. You do end up getting doubles. You can't eliminate it entirely, but I think the community has done a very good job of trying to address that. At least they are actively thinking about how to do that.
I see. And that brings up a natural topic, which is, how do you see, besides some of these changes in rule sets and stuff, how else do you see Hema evolving in these next decades?
Well, there's been a lot more. This kind of ties in with like actually how Hema works, I guess, as a collective, which I think is really kind of one of the most important things to address. If you're interested in understanding what Hema is, you kind of need to understand how it functions, right? So like in a lot of traditional martial arts, it's like, okay, we've got, this lineage and this guy created the art and then passed it down to these students and these students passed it down. In Hema, what happened was a bunch of people in the medieval, like in the Middle Ages and onwards, wrote down the art kind of in a manual and what's really interesting is that HEMA is like actually a very, very modern phenomenon. I think it's only possible because of the internet, actually. Yeah, this is what's super cool because like I actually work in software development, and I would say it's very similar to like open source software development. And that, yeah. So what happened was there was a huge effort, and actually a site called Lichtenauer exists, which is a play on like wiki and Lichtenauer, which is the kind of the highest like German, master, the guy who kind of like started like we have like the Kunst des Fechtens, right? He's kind of like the Musashi of Germany, I guess is the easiest way of describing it. And then, so he went around and trained at a bunch of different places and collected a bunch of different, I would say, like disparate techniques into one complete system. And then he wrote things down in what are called couplets. It's like little mnemonic poems in order to help the students remember, the different lessons and the different techniques and stuff. And so what happened was he then had, it's almost impossible to understand those couplets without like heavy commentary. Fortunately for us, he had a bunch of his like students. So like this next generation formed what was called like the Lichtenauer Society. And they wrote extensive commentaries and their own versions and variations and all of this stuff on these original teachings. And so what ended up happening was kind of all over. You got different expansion and commentary and variation on all of this stuff. And I think it's interesting to kind of note like the cultural aspect of the medieval period in Europe, where it's like, I was taught this, and then you have to understand kind of that there was a lot more of a guild system mentality, where it's like you're taught something, you apprentice, you become a journeyman, and eventually you display your mastery through a mastercraft or a masterwork or whatever. And then you're accepted as a master, and then you teach and all that stuff. So master has a little bit of a different context from what people tend to think of in like the kung fu master off on the mountaintop. It's a lot more practical. It's like there are master craftsmen today, right? Like it's so what happened was all of these books, people became very interested in this. I would say a lot of the early efforts were towards the end of the 90s, and then they started like finding these books and then compiling them and putting together translations in a group effort. Like I really can't emphasize how much this is like absolutely kind of a group effort to understand all this stuff. And then, with YouTube, people started looking at this stuff, and then it started to gain more popularity, and then they started making videos and putting up videos, and then people would compare the videos, and then the competition, they started putting competitions together, and then you kind of, you could see how all of the elements, like the internet and communication and stuff, were really critical to compiling all of this information, then being able to understand it. Because, I mean, I've looked over the Longest Messer, like I call it the Longest Messer Bible. It's a treatise by a guy called Johannes Le Kuchner. And if you don't have a pretty solid foundation in a lot of the other arts, it's not really obvious what he's describing. You can't just like pop it open and be like, oh, I know what that is. But now we have so many people who've been like working through it. And this is what's interesting, because it's a very medieval experience, like kind of echoed in the current times, where it's like, you look at the instructions, you work it out, and you don't, it's not just like, oh, here, this is how it is. And it's just given to you. It's a lot more of you read it, you experience it, you work on it, you try to apply it, you go through this entire process again and again, and you try to just keep working on it until eventually you're able to actually apply it, and then eventually it just becomes like it's fully integrated into the person's fencing, right? So
I think what's really interesting is that it seems like the HEMA community, just from talking to you, is really all about let's all work together and find out what works. Instead of like, it seems like with a lot of the traditional styles, they went the other direction as technology made knowledge more available, which is like, no, our secret way, our time practice way is actually the best. All this new research, all this new evidence, no. Our thing is, so it's interesting how HEMA kind of is evolving with the internet and with the freedom of information, whereas a lot of some of the other arts that you always see the MMA people destroy seem to just like not know how to like evolve and adapt. And that's just like, I'm still kind of mind blown, but I'm also very happy for the HEMA community that you're just like, okay, let's put all this stuff there, let's all analyze it together, let's all learn, let's all, do all this stuff.
Yeah, there was like what I call like the dark early days where a few people tried to kind of put a stranglehold on like the knowledge of like, oh, you have to be a part of this group in order to get, and then those people who had a very kind of cult-like attitude quickly, sooner or later, those people always jump the shark somehow. And then once that organization kind of like breaks down and splinters and fractures, then it's like, okay, well, now it's just back to the collective of people who are genuinely trying to figure it out. Mm-hmm. And that's really what I like about the HEMA community in specific is, and it's not absolutely everybody. Like you have some, like there are internal kind of like rivalries. There are the dark horses within the community or whatever. And like, but I would say on average, most HEMA people are really, really have a genuine like enthusiasm and a genuine interest in like learning the art and being able to apply it. And I think like what I was talking about before with the, you think you want to start off and you think you want to learn how to fight. You want to like, oh, that'll be cool and stuff. I mean, ultimately, I think the thing that keeps people around is kind of that community effort in a lot of ways. Or it's like, I was talking to my wife about this. I was trying to explain to her the most important skill you can develop as just a human in general is the ability to recognize when the thing you are doing doesn't line up with your intentions. And in the rest of life, I find it's very easy to have those things disconnected and not have any ability to determine, right? If you're an artist and you're like, oh, I think my art is all amazing and stuff, right? And then it's like, well, technically there are all of these problems. Oh, but that's my style. You can fall back on that pretty easily, right? And it's like, well, okay, well, with swordsmanship, right? It's like, oh, you want to do wonky footwork and like contort yourself into weird ways. It's like, okay, you can try that, but at the end of the day, like we practice free play regularly, and it's like you'll be confronted by the fact that you're getting hit a lot. You're not able to consistently hit your opponent. They're basically getting clean hits on you, so you're going to have to change something up. Yeah. And that's a large part of why I take video as well, because it's hard to recognize it initially. Like it's hard to recognize what's happening as you're doing it. Yeah. And like HEMA from the outside is very different. Like watching a fight as compared to being in a fight, it is totally different. Yeah. The second you put on that mask and you're like fencing, it's like the training feels it feels kind of disconnected the first few times you get into it, because all of a sudden it's like, whoa, like it feels like everything is like really fast. Mm-hmm. And there's no cooperation from your partner, or yeah. I mean, for the first few times, obviously you're not going to just like try to beat down the other person, but you're going to try to push them in order to use the tools that, use the techniques and stuff that you've been working on. Yeah. But it feels like suddenly, there's just like this free fall, and your perspective on how things happen when you're in that mask and you're fencing are totally different from someone who's outside. Like, I mean, initially, before I started doing a lot more free play and before it became like a consistent, regular part of the class, it was a lot easier for me to kind of like criticize, oh, well, you should have done this and this here, right? But I imagine it must be the exact same with boxing. Like I used to do a bit of boxing, but I haven't done boxing in quite a long time, where, you know, you can look at someone who's fighting and be like, oh, well, you just need to do this, you know, you just need to like slip and do a hook there, right? Where it's like, okay, but, you know, the execution of it is actually difficult. Like, until, like, it's one thing to be like, yes, I call it like, there's a little bit of, there's a few stages, right? There's like, okay, I need to learn the movements. This is what the movement is, right? That's raw execution. And then you need to learn, oh, this is the movement that I do against that movement. It's like the rock, paper, scissors. And then it's like, oh, you know, I had a student tell me recently, he kind of had like this mental breakthrough, like just before the whole every social event being shut down thing. He's like, you know, I used to think it was like exactly like rock, paper, scissors. Like if they do this and you do this, you should like beat them. Mm-hmm. And he's like, what I realized is it's like, well, no, it gives you the most, it increases your odds of hitting them without being hit, but it's not like a foregone conclusion. Even if you do the correct technique, they're still adapting to what you do. And this is where I get into like, this is like the real game of Hema, where it's not just, oh, they did this, you should have done that. It's like, oh, your opponent is adapting to you like each fraction of a second. Like it depends. And people who are more well-trained will be making decisions at a much higher rate than someone who's less well-trained, right? And being able to adapt to what your opponent is doing is like absolutely critical to being a good fencer. It's not like, oh, okay, if they throw, you know, a cross, I'm going to do this. It's like, well, you know, as you start doing whatever your like counter technique is, like, you know, you start slipping, maybe they were setting it up, maybe they were expecting you to slip and it was a feint. You don't necessarily know. Like, there's a lot of nuance there that I feel isn't obvious from the outside, and it's very hard to convey that through video. And a lot of people will just be like, well, I watched a few Hema videos. Oh, well, you should obviously just do this technique. It's like, well, then just, I mean, it's more of like, this is more of a provocation in terms of like, well, then get out there and fence, right? I mean, the motto for my group is Sprechen mit Aktionen, which is not good German, I know, but it means speak with action. It comes out to something more like talking to action, but it's the same as like saying, oh, speaking with action sounds like, you know, you could misinterpret it as well. But the point is, you should be using your action. Like if you have something to say, a lot of the time it's like, well, get out there and execute it. Show me how you're executing it, right? A lot of times I'll find people will give criticism, like armchair criticism, and it's like, okay, show me how you train it. Show me you break down the movement, break down how it's supposed to work for me, right? If you can. If not, it's fine. And then show yourself using it in a free play scenario, preferably, you know, multiple times, right? Give multiple examples, and it's like that will give me enough information in order to figure out what's going on and how to improve. But just being like, oh, well, you should just do this is like, it's like, okay, well, that's fine, like, you know, but it makes it a lot harder for somebody to take that and work with it. And they're definitely, you know, you do need that. Sometimes you do need someone to just tell you, hey, look, you know, like, you need to reevaluate this. And then I feel like a lot of times developing, I would say, humility in order to recognize that you do need to go back and re-examine something. Like, that's part of what's so awesome about studying this stuff, right? Every time I go back and read through Le Kuchner for like the 20th time at this point, as you begin to practice and as you go back, there's more and more there. It's one of these manuscripts are very much like that. It's like, you know, if you, I'm a big fan of Musashi's Book of Five Rings, and every time I go back to that and read it, I'm just like, oh man, there's so much here. Like, I've grown, and it's continuously opening up as I practice the stuff that is talked about, it continuously opens and allows me to understand more.
Yeah.
And like, I find that by having the humility to admit that you don't know everything and not everything is such a certainty, it allows you to go and experience that kind of continuous opening of what the art is. It's like, because otherwise it just stays in this tiny little box, and all that, like, everyone else is going to be interpreting things differently. And it just means that you're going to stay behind, locked to that one perception of something, and everybody else is going to continue developing. It's like, it's more of a tragedy for yourself not to open up to that and have that attitude.
Yeah, totally. It's just so interesting. Like you said, the more you get into that journey, the more you realize there's just so much nuance. And like you said, a lot of people think of fighting as chess. It's not even like chess. It's fighting in probably a weirder way is more like Go, or I like to think of it just like quantum mechanics. It's literally like quantum mechanics. There's different percentages of things, and it's always constantly changing. And if you think of it like chess, where it's like one move to the next move, that you're already kind of behind. It kind of like the flow and just the constant uncertainty of how real situations occur and how sparring matches, etc., occur. And it's interesting that you mentioned boxing too, because before I started taking boxing lessons, I was like, oh yeah, boxing is just a little bit of footwork, a little bit of head movement, a little bit of like a few different types of punches. And then you start training it, you're like, wow, it's so much more complex than I thought. And I think that's kind of the thing. It's like people will kind of think they kind of have a gist of it, and then they'll start training it. They're like, wow, it's way more complicated than just like watching it from the outside. Because watching from the outside, you don't really notice all this stuff until you start doing it. You're like, oh, so much more went into what I saw than like what I understood, because I didn't understand it. It's just so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I really am not a fan of the chess analogy for fighting, because like you said, like chess is a turn-based kind of deterministic linear game that you can recreate, right? You can play chess by like citing your moves out to each other. It's like if you're going to make chess analogous to fighting, it would be like, well, you're both able to move your pieces whenever you want, and the board, like the state of the game, is evaluated continuously every moment. Right? And if you can move your pieces faster than the opponent, that's also a thing you can do. Right? Like, it's continuous, right? Actually, what's interesting is one of the things that really kind of changed my perception on how to train in martial arts in general was fighting games. And I would argue that in a lot of ways, fighting games are like a non-physical version of a martial art. Or there is physical execution, but it's like, it has all the same aspects to it, with like being able to understand like timing and range and distance, and you can set up a lot of the same concepts, or like there's a lot of stuff that is a lot more analogous to actual martial arts in a fighting game than you'd initially think. It's like, okay, can I trick them into reacting in the way that I want, right? Like, and it does take a certain amount of like experience in fighting games. When I was in university, like I played a lot of fighting games, which is kind of where I started to get a little bit more into them. But being able to control space, being able to control range, being able to see what your opponent's doing and react to it, and being able to adapt to their action is very similar to what you do in martial arts. I prefer martial arts in a lot of ways. Like, I prefer Hema because, I can actually use my entire body, and, it's a much more embodied experience. But you can get a lot more, you can gain an understanding. It's close enough that you can start to understand what's happening if you play fighting games, which is not exactly obvious. And the other thing is that, so the training aspect of it, I initially had a lot more of this, you need to do drills, you should practice, you should polish your fundamentals, like, I guess, there's a movie called The Hoosiers, which is like, oh, just focus on fundamentals, right? Like, you will get destroyed in the real world if that's all you do.
Yeah.
So what I was finding was when I would just sit in training mode and just practice like a combo, just practice, my execution. It's fine if you're just trying to be able to do, the core of the movement, but that's all it gets you.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you'll be able to, like, you can practice a combo in training mode and when there's another player playing, you're not going to be able to execute that combo unless you've executed it against an opponent that's actually attacking you, because you don't have the same opportunity, right? You have to be able to spot the opening to apply that stuff. Like, it's the exact same in boxing, right? You need to look for when you need to be able to, and it's not necessarily a conscious thing. It's like after you do it so many times, after you've been sparring with somebody and you see that little thing, you'll be doing it before you actually realize, It's like that, cultivating that is incredibly important in martial arts in general. Like, if you're thinking about what you're doing as you're doing it, you're already behind in the number of turns you're taking, because you're having to stop and then plan your next move and do all of this. It needs to come naturally, and that's why you need the video to then go back and look at it, and then you fix the errors you're consistently making in training, right? And that's what a coach or an instructor should really be doing for you, is seeing these systematic kinds of flaws and then coming up with drills that will then correct them.
Yeah, totally. Man, this is such a great conversation. Tell me about your teaching style. I mean, we're kind of getting it a little just talking to you, but like when students come and learn from you, how do you assess their abilities? What do you start them out in?
I could actually just kind of show you some of this stuff. So we'll just kind of like double with the a little bit of like how swordsmanship kind of works. So I like to have the glove on just because it forces me to you fence with the glove on, so you have to get used to using it. It's a part of your tool set. That's another important point, is you have to use the tool set you're going to use. Like, you have to get as close to possible, like whatever you're training for, you have to get as close as possible to those conditions as you can. So I'll just show, right? So what I start with is we do this drill, and there's a technique called the Vinden, which is it's literally just moving your hand like this. And there are a lot of things that come out of that. So I start off by getting people to actually put the point against the wall and just learn to do this. And you had asked about footwork in swordsmanship, actually. So the way that this is done, I'll try to angle the camera down a little more. Right? So I want, if my hilt is on my right side, I want my back foot there. And this is actually very similar to wrestling. It gives you a lot more of kind of a wrestling type of base. So you go like this, and then you raise it up, right? Rotate down and across, change your feet, rotate up. So real quick, one of the core mechanics used in all fencing is the idea of, and we call it strong and weak. Basically, this part of your sword has no give. This part of your sword has give, right? So you use the part down here to push on the opponent's part up here. So, So what I ideally want to do is, if I'm over here, I would want to push their sword like this, right? And you can see how this kind of slides into position. And that's a lot. I'll try to get closer. That's a lot more what this cross guard is useful for. It's for just kind of having something to push against. And then from here, you can attack like this. Or if you're doing a counter cut, right, you'd want to cut something like this. And you can cut across like that to your opponent, right? But I then would just explain, okay, so we've been doing this thing, There's another grip, right? You can also grip it like this with your thumb on the inside, called the thumb grip, right? And then realistically, from here, if you want to do cuts, bring the point back, move the hand, put the point forward. Bring the point back, move the hand, point forward, right? So all the cuts come from that core movement. Right?
I see.
And then basically, a lot of the other techniques are if you're rotating, right? So I can keep the point still. I'll just step back from the camera a little bit so it's easier to see. I can pivot the sword around my hand as a cut, right? And I can pivot around the middle, usually for thrusts, right? Usually. So if you're pivoting around the sword, it's more point. Knocked my base over. Right? You can keep the point still, and that is really good for controlling the center line. Because see how what's important to pay attention to is where the strong goes. This is where I'm defending.
Yeah.
And then from here, I can continue to push the point forward. The other important thing is being able to pivot around the middle. So for instance, if someone's sword is here and they do a parry kind of action like this, we would call it an empty displacement. As they do that, I don't have to cut up and over their sword, right? I would just go from here, turn the sword around and cut behind their sword, right? And if they continue to displace wide, then I can dip my sword under or I can cut over, however. And that's really, I mean, the core of, I would say, all of the plays is you do your initial cut. You end up in a bind. Usually from here, you'll wind up and then get your strong onto where their weak would be and attack them in some way. If they displace you, you would start doing something like this, which we would call a duplieren, right? And if they displace you as you're doing this, if they go wide, you would cut over their sword. The other thing is, if you get your strong onto their weak, you can go completely over their sword, basically go underneath their arm and thrust them. And it ends up, their sword goes like this, your sword would then be going in through here, and you thrust them. That's usually how I sum it up for a new student. And then, we'll go through and then we practice, okay, I'm going to hold my sword out, as if I'm doing in what's called Longenart, which is just shoulder height, full reach. And then I get them to do a cut where they make contact with the strong and then, displace and then attack from there. Then we do counter cuts, and then we start working in like the various other techniques. So you can do like a counter thrust, you can do counter cuts, and then then we start working on that duplieren, that cut from this without leaving the bind, and then we work on like being able to cut around, doing drills like that. So one person's continuously attacking, the other person's continuously defending, and the goal is to like build up those core skills and kind of like the training room of a fighting game where you're just playing with your buddy and they're just like, okay, I'm going to try to I'm just going to do the jump sweep mix up, right? You got to do anti-airs and then, you start throwing in the grabs to mix them up a little bit. And then it's like, oh, and you want to let them really to figure out how to deal with all the different options themselves kind of in a natural way. Because more than explicitly explaining things, the more they're going to get, all of the words that I use and stuff is going to carry baggage with it. Whereas the raw experience just conveys, there's a quote in one of the manuscripts. It's like I actually have it. It's like the Pole House book. Hang on. I pulled this up ahead of time because, the Pole House book. And he says, where is it here? Oh, here we go. Because practice is better than empty art, for practice is fully sufficient without art. But art is not fully sufficient with practice.
Ooh.
And if you understand art to be, we'll say, the abstract theory or all of the, explanations for why things work, it's honestly, if you end up training and you just understand with the principles that I explained in a little bit of the movement patterns I've shown, you can pretty much derive everything that's in the books right? So they become kind of like a way of checking your homework. You're like, okay, am I applying this in the best way? Or, like, how have other people done it? And that's part, again, feeds into the whole Hema thing, where it's like, well, when you're watching what other people are doing, you start to see, oh, hey, they applied this in this different way or this different context, and all of a sudden it like opens up new possibilities, and then you're like, oh, hey. So in that regards, the art is a lot more of, it's like a tool set of cuts, thrusts, winding. Like it's like maybe 5 things total. And that's why I just tell new students, I'm like, well, swordsmanship is actually not very complicated. It's just hard.
Yeah.
So, I mean, understanding like what the goals are, which is avoid getting cut, being able to cut your opponent, being able to balance offense and defense, and using the tool set, it all of a sudden, like in my opinion, it becomes an art rather than just a predefined kind of a, here's like the closed definition of what this is.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I alluded to previously with the how the style versus style thing to me nowadays just seems quite ludicrous, honestly, because, well, okay, it's a boxer versus, like a Jeet Kune Do guy. It's like, okay, but like, which boxer? Is it like Joe Schlub from like, who's trained for like 2 weeks versus some guy who like has a background in, like wrestling and like Muay Thai, who also does like Jeet Kune Do? It's like, I don't care about the style necessarily. To me, what it says is a lot more about the way that they're training, and you can see certain artifacts of training in certain ways, right? Like, and you've kind of touched on it in your commentaries, where usually you're like, oh, that guy got tagged, and you can see him like flailing and shoving his arms out, and it's just like, yeah, like he doesn't have a trained response, which means he hasn't been hit like that, which you can deduce a lot about how they're training. And a lot of my criticism is not about the art itself. It's not like, oh, like, look, a punch is a punch, a kick is a kick, like whatever, like if you're learning how to actually be able to deliver that to the opponent consistently in a way that gives you an advantage in the fight, I don't care which kicks you use, right? Muay Thai uses certain kicks, Taekwondo uses certain kicks. I never thought like flying spinning back kick would be an effective tool, but it apparently is if you can land it.
Yeah.
So who am I to judge that? Like, so at the end of the day, does it really matter? It's like, well, what matters is a lot more about how somebody's training. What are the rule sets? People adapt to rule sets. That's why they're so important. If you're just doing point sparring, you're not going to hit in a way that's designed to truly damage your opponent, right? If you're not allowed to hit to the face, you won't.
Yeah, exactly. It was so interesting also, adding on to your point, like, it's so funny. For example, some days I'm thinking more about jiu-jitsu. Maybe me and my roommate does jiu-jitsu a lot, so me and my roommate we're like doing jiu-jitsu stuff. And so when I'm walking outside, I'm literally thinking about jiu-jitsu. So then I have to catch myself and be like, okay, stop thinking about jiu-jitsu when you're walking outside, because if you get attacked on the street, since you're thinking about jiu-jitsu, you're going to do jiu-jitsu. And then you're going to end up on the ground, which you don't want to do on the street. Right? So it's like, people literally, because that's what's going on in their mind, that's what's going on in their body, they're building new muscle connections, muscle memory in their brains. So like, how they train is going to be how they like react. Exactly like you said. So
absolutely.
If you're training with no punches to the face for like 5 years, then the first time you fight, when someone's going to punch you in the face, you'll be like, huh? I don't even know how to punch to the face. Huh?
Yeah, like, you're going to freak out when you get hit in the face, and you're not going to hit the other person in the face.
Yeah.
Like, this is my largest criticism for how, not all of traditional martial arts, but how they're trained. Like, Muay Thai is arguably a traditional martial art. They train it in a very specific way.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that it's like, well, you also see a lot of convergence between arts that actually train in similar conditions.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've heard this as like a criticism, and it just blows my mind. It makes no sense to me, right? It's like, okay, so you find something, right, like a shoulder crank in like folk wrestling or like ringing, right, or an arm bar, and then it's like, oh well, that came from jujitsu, or it's like, no, not necessarily. Like jujitsu is really like a offshoot of judo.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's different now. Like it's quite distinct now, but it came from. It has a lineage that traces directly back to the founder of judo.
Yeah.
So, none of this, like, it's not like, oh, this is taken from there or whatever. It's like, yeah, obviously, if you have a similar set of goals, you're going to see a lot of convergence.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And that's exactly what you see, for instance, in all kinds of, like, that's why I like training with people who study different weapons or different schools of the same weapon. So in longsword, in the German style, it's highly focused on staying in the bind in the middle and forcing like the attacks through the Winden, whereas the Italian school is a lot more about trying to displace your opponent's sword and then cutting around behind, which we have in the German system. There's a cut called the Krumpau, which is the equivalent of like the standard kind of Italian style displacement or parry, but the German system emphasizes staying in the middle and staying in the bind and cutting around when the opponent pushes off to the side where you have an opening. This is like two sides of the same coin. It's like, oh yeah, you should get good at both, fighting from the bind and cutting around, because they're both useful depending on the circumstances. So, and you just see a lot of the same techniques evolve again and again and again using different weapons. And what's interesting is that because the weapons are different, the specifics of how they're executed vary, but the core principles are the exact same. And when you start to see past the implementation into what the objective is and how it works on a mechanical level, all of a sudden, like, all of this stuff opens up to you, and I can start talking with the broadsword guys, right, the Scottish broadsword guys, and I can start talking to people who fence with small sword, and I can start talking to people who fence with rapier, because all of the thrust bind work is pretty much the same. Like, it's not different. It just... And I guess that's a lot of the combination of, like, okay, recognizing that when you're criticized and, like, hey, the training isn't working, and being able to restructure so that you then, have an effective training style, and then be able to communicate instead of like, oh, we have this secret technology which you are not able to get without like washing a floor for 2 years and it's just, to me, it makes no sense in the modern age. Like, look, you're not going to go out and you're not going to fight with swords. Like, if you are, you're going to jail. Don't do that.
Or you're living in a country that you probably shouldn't be in, because if you're fighting with swords, it's probably not a safe place legally, if you're fighting with swords legally.
Well, and the recurring theme of, like, you start studying martial arts, never get in a fight again. Like, I mean, that has held true in my experience as well.
Absolutely.
But it's just like, you realize that it's like, it doesn't matter how much I train, the other guy could get a lucky shot off. Something out of my control could happen. I could trip, smash my head on the concrete, and be an invalid for the rest of my life. I don't want to bother with that. Like, what's the point? I want to continue to go to the gym, go to the club and train with proper protective equipment and, use this to continue enriching my life. That's why I do it.
And 2 points to add on to what you said. One is like you said, I love what you said. Rule sets will make the style, basically. So why is it that in the ring everything just looks like kickboxing or Muay Thai? Because that's what the rules make effective. The example of when we looked at that Hema versus Kung Fu, one of those original Hema videos we looked at, the second Kung Fu guy seeing his teammate get destroyed, you know what he started doing? He started spamming attacks too. And he was more effective than the first Kung Fu guy, because he realized the way the rules and the technology was designed, we just have to spam attacks and be better at spamming attacks. So the second Kung Fu guy looked exactly like the Hema guy fighting. He just started spamming attacks. And he still lost, but he did better than the first Kung Fu guy versus the first Hema guy. Right? So you apply that paradigm. If there was a type of martial art that said you could do everything but no grappling and no punches to the face, then it would probably look like Taekwondo or Kyokushin. It would look like no matter what style you go in there, you look like that. Right? Recently on my channel, we looked at, it was like, if you went to the ground, you had like 3 seconds, and then if you push people out of the ring, you also got points. So then, the fight style changed, right? It didn't look like MMA in the cage, like you said, because the rules dictate what is effective. It's such a brilliant point you made that, like, I wasn't able to express until I heard it from you. Like, really, it's not that, like, Wing Chun is ineffective in the ring because of rules. No, it's that anything can be effective, it's just you have to adapt it to the rules. And when you adapt it to the rules, it's not going to look like the original.
Yeah, and I feel like in a lot of ways that's a big problem with Wing Chun, is the way that the art has been passed on, right, that lineage and, this is what my teacher said, so I do what my teacher said, and at some point, like, I would argue the founder would probably be like, yeah, well, obviously you should change if you're in that circumstance. Like, I feel like so much of this stuff that's been built up into the, this is what, Supreme O-Sensei said. It's like, look, like, you are the artist. Yeah. Use the tools, right? But, like, I find that kind of rigid thinking to be very counterproductive. And the better, like, if you learn how to adapt your tools to that rule set, like you're saying, obviously it will change, and there will be convergence. And there is a bit of an argument to be made for, like, well, if you already have something that's adapted to that rule set, then why not use, like, that's already more, like, close to working in that rule set, why not use that rule set? Or sorry, right? Why not use that set of tools? But I don't know. I just find that a lot of, like, it really comes back over and over again to the way you train is the way you fight. And if you aren't adapting to whatever kind of environment, whatever situation you're going to be using your art in, and you continue limiting yourself based on something that's probably been misunderstood through 5 people, it's going to lose all effectiveness, right? It's just like when all you practice is doing a dance, that's all you're going to do. And I mean, I'm not against practicing things like in a solo drill. I just find it to be of limited use. It's useful for that initial phase that I was talking about, like being able to do the execution. You go in a training room in a fighting game and learn how to throw a fireball. Doesn't mean you're going to be good at using a fireball in the game against people who are experienced, but you need to build up the capability to just do it by itself. Like, I can't expect a completely new student to just jump straight into free play and be able to do anything.
Yeah, exactly.
But, and I find that refusal to adapt and insistence on, like, the tradition's right because it's right thing is this is the thing that continuously holds these styles back. Is it's like they just won't let go of whatever it is that's holding them back. And then they build up these kinds of ideas around, like, it's immoral to test this in the ring kind of a situation. It's immoral to, like, do sparring or competition. And it's like, it ends up being really damaging to the practice as a whole. It's like being like, okay, we're going to teach you how to, build a house, but you're only going to study it in a classroom. And if you go and actually build the house, it's immoral. Like, what, how, like, it's absurd to me. I have no other way of putting it. Like, it just seems absurd. And, like, if you want to study with, like, in the interview you just released for, like, well-being and health benefits and all that, that's fine. But it's deceptive and predatory, frankly, to try to tell people, this will make you good at fighting. It won't, and that false confidence will lead to people getting hurt. And I frankly consider that to be, like, immoral.
Yeah, exactly. 100%, man. Last part of the conversation, I wanted to ask you, we were talking about this before I started recording, about sort of the wrestling components to Hema, because, even when you were demonstrating some of the sword techniques, you basically, to master anything related to weapons play, sword play, you have to understand leverage in a way that's very like grappling. So, and then you also mentioned before I talked that so much of like Hema is like the sword, the weapon is an extension of your grappling. So could you expand on this? Tell the audience more about the grappling aspects of Hema?
Definitely. So I'll just grab my glove real quick because this is kind of helpful to get some of the idea. So, for instance, there are roughly two types of two general branches to the weapon arts, those being like what's called harness fighting, which means you're in full armor, and then blossfechten, which is you're not in armor. So when you're in full armor, you can't actually just cut at your opponent. Like the armor works quite well, like amazingly well. I mean, even like cloth armor, and like the stuff that we use, it greatly mitigates all like most injuries. Like, of course, there's exceptions, but it works. So with this glove, because this is like flared out, and this is again closely modeled after like actual medieval gauntlets, like an hourglass type gauntlet. What's interesting is when you have this, right, this thing is all frilled up, and your the protection on your forearm would actually be quite tight. So what happens is there's this opening here. So you end up going in with what's called half swording. So when you're fighting against an armored opponent, actually going like this it turns this into a dagger, basically. And you'll be fencing like this. And one of the things you want to do is hook your point into your opponent's glove like this, and then you wrench it back, and you can do a shoulder crank on them. So you get it in, and you can crank it either this way, or if you get it in underneath, and it's actually stabbing into the palm of your hand as you do this and crank back. It's the other thing is in armor, because if you're not using a poleaxe, for instance, you'd want to basically wrestle the opponent to the ground, and a lot of times in medieval battles, you would actually have the visor open so that you can see more and you can hear more and you can communicate, because that's what's important in a battle. You have the visors a lot more for things like tourneys, like jousting had like specific helmets and stuff. But on the battlefield, a lot of the time you have the visor up when you're not getting shot at with arrows. So when someone has their visor open, it's just it's less effort to basically throw them on the ground and then stab them in the face, right? Or there are small gaps in the armor, right? And what happens is, plate mail, there's a reason this thing is like as long as my forearm, right? Like this is a huge weapon compared to like a modern knife. So there's a strong distinction between like fencing with a rondel dagger and like knife fighting as people would understand it these days. Don't try to apply this stuff. It's incredibly like, this stuff is not like, hey, it doesn't translate to street self-defense stuff. Like I'm just gonna put that out there, right? Because like, look, if someone comes at you with like, this is actually a triangular spike, as long as your forearm, like, you should get the hell out of there. Like no, like, leave, right? But if you're wrestling with somebody and you're wrestling with somebody who's in armor, it's really good because you can get into the gaps where there's only mail, and you can push into it, and like the tip will go through the rings of the mail and compress in and start stabbing into them.
I see.
Which, it's quite savage. And the other thing is the groin area. So the way the armor is built, kind of the groin area is a lot more exposed. So if you throw someone to the ground, you can also stab them into the groin, because there's kind of like a little armored skirt thing, and then the upper part of the thigh armor is usually separate, and it's like suspended to the rest of the garment. But there are openings in the joints, right? Or like the inside of the elbow, for instance, is usually vulnerable.
Yeah, makes sense. And it sucks that the human anatomy, it's like, to be able to effectively move our hips and our legs, our groin has to be a little exposed. It's like unfortunate part of human anatomy. If you protect the groin too well, you literally can't move well.
Yeah. So one of the other things that's pretty interesting about the wrestling side of things is that we do a lot more wrestling with weapons, because the entire system is not like, poleaxe is strongly and distinctly separated from longsword, right? If you hold a longsword like by the hilt, right, and what's like a murder stroke grip, right, it becomes a mini poleaxe, right? So every weapon kind of bleeds into every other weapon. That's what makes it, in my opinion, such a interesting system, because when you learn the mechanics of one weapon, you have a foundation to start working on the mechanics of another weapon, right? Messer is like very similar to sword and buckler. Like sword and buckler, you have the buckler, which is just a tiny shield in your hand, and you can use that to go in and pin your opponent's sword to their body. But with Messer, you're actually, a lot of the time, like, you'd close in, and as you're doing those disengage, or like, if you're pushing their sword across as you're going to cut around, you can grab their arm and pull it down and still pin it to their body. So it combines the wrestling with the swordsmanship. And then if you're even just, like, even when we're doing just wrestling, a lot of the time we'll actually, like, throw in the daggers. So both guys will have, like, daggers, like, in their belts or whatever. And as you're wrestling, it's a combination of, like, trying to be able to draw your dagger out, and basically we don't like stab each other when we're like pinned on the mat, like without arm. That's you know, you just make people unhappy that way. But you know, being able to draw your dagger and threaten the opponent is the goal, and I think that's where a lot of you know, Western wrestling systems focus on that pin, because the idea is when you have a pin, right, you have someone like knee on belly, for instance, and you're pinning down the arm that would be drawing a weapon, you can pull out your dagger, right, really easily. So it kind of brings up a lot of other interesting things, and again ties back into the rule system. It's like modern jiu-jitsu is highly specialized for modern jiu-jitsu, which is one-on-one competitions where the opponent doesn't have a weapon. And I think something that's interesting is in Japanese jiu-jitsu, it seems like there's a lot more artifacts of the battlefield applications. So like it's telling you the armbar in Japanese jiu-jitsu is done with the legs, the shins crossed. And one compelling argument I've heard for that is, if you're armbarring somebody and they happen to be pulling out, you know, their tanto or wakizashi or whatever, and they're trying to stab you as you're doing this, if your legs are straight, they have a straight path in to start trying to, like, basically stab you in, like, the stomach or, like, the groin. Whereas if your legs are crossed, you can actually do a lot to jam that thing, and it becomes really hard for you to reach over. So I suppose I would just say that it's worth kind of thinking about why something might be that way, or why the differences might exist. And sometimes these systems, it's almost like vestigial parts of them, right? Where it's like, it was there to deal with something, but if you're not having to actually deal with that condition anymore, it won't make any sense why it was like that. And I just think that a lot of times people tend to have the attitude of like, oh, well, you know, it's so much more effective than anything that has ever come before. And it's like, well, it's more effective for the environment you're using it in, certainly. But it might be worth just kind of exploring why something may have developed differently, because it's actually a little bit of an extra step to cross your shins, for instance. So
It's so interesting hearing you talk about this, because I think about like ancient China, right? In different dynasties, the laws for carrying around weapons were different too. Like in some dynasties in China, everyone walked around with the sword. Even people who didn't know how to fight walked around with the sword. One, because you were allowed to, and two, if someone came to rob you and you had a sword, at least you could kind of pull it out and pretend that, like, and maybe that'll like keep them at bay when you run or something, right? So like you think about maybe like why Chinese styles. There is something called dog fighting that like started in the Ming Dynasty when China started fighting the Japanese pirates, and probably there was a lot of cross influence, and that's why dog style looks a lot like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But like that's the only kind of true grappling I've seen in a lot of like Chinese styles. A lot of Chinese Kung Fu styles have a lot of joint locks and stuff like that, and maybe it was because it was designed in the day when everyone had carried around swords. So your first thing would be to lock their joints so they can't like stab you or like get to their sword, right? So like Skillen says, you have to look at the context of like why this style has this, because probably the rules, the laws, the environmental factors dictated that this is what was the most effective at the time.
Yeah, that reminds me of something I didn't mention with longest messer. Longest messer actually means long knife. Mm-hmm. And the reason it's called a long knife is, if you can see the handle construction, see how it's two slabs of wood on the side? Uh-huh. Like, most people would be like, oh, that's a sword. It's like, well, legally by, medieval German laws, this was a knife. And people were allowed to carry knives. Mm-hmm. Peasants were not allowed to carry swords. So you had people who were allowed to carry those, but they wouldn't be allowed to carry something with a basically through hilt construction, which would then be a sword.
That'd be a sword. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really interesting. Like the point you brought up where it's like, well, if someone's trying to be drawing a weapon, it would actually make a little bit of sense because you're not worried about getting hit in the face. You're worried about stopping them from pulling, a sword or a knife out. And if you can get the wrist lock as they're trying to pull it out, you could potentially control the weapon and disable the hand that has the thing that will kill you instantly. And, run away afterwards or whatever.
Exactly. Like, get some kind of quote-unquote small joint lock on them and just to disable them and you run. It makes sense from the context of, they have a weapon where it literally takes two hands to pull it out. Well, their two hands are occupied. You don't have to worry about them trying to kick you or elbow you or punch you. You go for the two joints here and disable it or, like, fight that, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because you see, like, in, a modern context where someone tries to pull out like a handgun or some other sort of sidearm and it's really close, and you'll see like a lot of times people will go for like things to control the hand. And it's like, well, okay, I mean, joint locks, they're not as effective in kind of a sport wrestling situation, but if you're just trying to stop something, like as soon as you put a weapon in the hand, actually it makes you have a lot more space for leverage to start wrenching on it, right? If someone has this, you can go into here and start turning it like this, right? Mm-hmm. Or, and in Messer, there's a move where you basically grab under, I'll use the actual Messer. Mm-hmm. So with the hilt, one of the Messer takings is you go in under like this and pull it like that, see? And so it's not like a true joint lock per se or a true wrist lock per se, but if someone's going like this and you can pull on it, it has a lot of similarities to a joint lock. Yeah. And if you think of Aikido, if you consider that they have a lot of stuff that at least the history of it's pretty murky, but if you're assuming that it's based around the concept of having a weapon in your hand, some of the stuff makes a little bit more sense. I'm not going to say that it wouldn't be my first option a lot of the time to do that stuff, but I feel like a lot of it is just demonstrating a mechanic rather than like the actual application. So in a lot of ways, I just would say like, hey, if there's something weird, maybe like look a little bit more into the context surrounding it. Maybe there's some explanation for why it's there. And then on top of that, like, just because something like, so for instance, a lot of stuff in Aikido isn't necessarily effective in the ring. But what are some of the principles that they're using, right? Some of the principles that they're using, so, they have that, I don't know the takedown, what it's called, but where they go, whoa, and then do that. Mm-hmm. There's something that we have called the back lever throw, and basically it's a combination of, like, what you're actually doing is you're kicking their leg out from behind as you go in and push back. And a lot of times it comes from a situation where if you do a cut, you go like this, mm-hmm. and then you reach over with your sword like this, get this on their neck, push their leg back as you're driving it down, and be done. Yeah. I think that stems primarily from like a wrestling with weapons specifically type of a system. Like, mm-hmm. and I think it's become kind of this, like, one of those vestigial parts. It's displaced from its original context, and there are other takedowns that make a lot more sense, right? Mm-hmm. Why not just single leg the guy? Well, if they have a weapon, and now all of a sudden the back of your head is exposed, even if they just have a hilt,
yeah,
right? That's what I would be doing.
Yeah.
So, like, that kind of stuff, I feel like we've lost so much of the context, but because of the current situation that we're in, well, maybe not right now, but in modern times, I feel like we have enough protective equipment, it's cheap enough, and we can actually start to explore this stuff, and I'm, like, super excited. Like, I feel like, the entire world has opened up so much, like, the possibilities have opened up so much more than ever before.
Yeah. I'll be honest, like, talking to you, I might go on Amazon, just order, like a prop knife or something, just so I can start exploring some knife defense. But, like, applying even like the Aikido stuff, or some of the Qingna Kung Fu stuff, or some of the Hema stuff, and trying to see if some of that stuff could work when someone has a blade. It's just so interesting. Like you said, we have so much information, and we have the technology to test this stuff safely as possible. I mean, there's always a risk, of course, but it's just like, I get a feeling, especially when you put weapons defense and all that into it, some of the old stuff that we consider vestigial might be dug up and like, oh, this actually could totally work with a smaller blade too, if someone's attacking you with a smaller blade or something like that. So, like, it's like an exciting thing to look forward to.
I mean, honestly, I don't know. I'm not making a claim that this is necessarily the case, but I'm excited about the possibility
of testing it. Because, I mean, I've looked at enough knife defense situations where, if you don't go for his stabbing arm, you're going to get stabbed. And even if you go for a stabbing arm, you're going to get stabbed probably anyways. But so many people who don't even go for the stabbing arm are definitely going to get stabbed and probably going to probably die. So, like, it seems like the scramble is just to control that arm that has the weapon, right? So already that's like, instead of just blindly scrambling to, like, control the weapon, maybe there's something you can bring in from Hema, or something you can bring in from, like, traditional martial arts involving that kind of joint lock or weapons defense that'll help you, give you an extra set of tools, so you're not just like, you're just like fighting for a toy almost, type of thing.
Yeah. Well, there's one video that I found really interesting. I think it's like functional knife defense, where they talk about, like, going in and basically getting control over the arm with the knife in it. I thought that was pretty reasonable for like, we'll say, more modern kind of things. But I think another major factor too is, like, when someone's trying to pull a weapon out, I feel like that is probably your best bet for a lot more of the controlling the wrist type of stuff. Not once it's already out. Like, that's where it's like, oh, it's pretty dicey. But you see someone go and, like, reach for something, it's like, oh, if you pin that arm and gain control over that I feel like is a opportune moment. Once it's out, it's like, ooh, that's exactly. A bad day for everyone.
Yep. Totally. Dude, this was such a fun and awesome and enlightening conversation. And guys, I'm so glad we finally got to get Skillen on. So I know your YouTube channel. I'll link it in the description. Is that your only YouTube channel, or do you have other channels too, or Instagram accounts, etc.?
The YouTube channel is the thing that is most consistently updated. Honestly, what it is the occasionally I'll get questions from people that I talk to online or whatever, and I'll kind of like put together a little bit of like say an online discussion of whatever I'm trying to demonstrate. So I've got some stuff like that, but mostly it's just video taken from the free play, and it's a lot more for basically seeing what we need to fix. Mm-hmm. So a lot of, like, you get to see a lot of, here's what it looks like, you know, kind of warts and all. It's not always the most elegant. It's not like a perfect demonstration of everything, but it's what we look at in order to continue working on our stuff. And I feel like it's the most kind of honest, we'll say, take on what the training is that I'm able to provide.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Cool. So for viewers of Fight Commentary Breakdowns, I would definitely put the link to his channel. And leave them questions, man. Leave them questions. Definitely bring them back. I mean, I know there's so much we haven't covered, so many topics we definitely talked about more. So for viewers, if you want to leave anything, any requests, any questions, etc., we'll definitely bring Skillen back. So, by the way, how'd you get your nickname Skillen?
That's my last name.
Oh, that's your last name. Sorry, I thought it was like a nick. I mean, it could be a cool nickname too, but it actually is your last name, which is cool.
Yeah. No, I've actually gotten asked that multiple times. Recently, a guy I was playing music with is like, oh, you know, like I wasn't sure, you know, if I should go with like your nickname or like your name. I'm like, it's just my last name. I just go by my last name because there are a bunch of other people named Cody. So
yeah, makes sense. In fact, I think on this channel we've interviewed people named Cody too, so it makes sense. You're the Skillen Cody.
Yeah, there we go.
Exactly. So guys, this was Fight Commentary Breakdowns. We can keep talking after this, but for everyone watching, please press subscribe, go to his channel, check it out, and leave your questions. Thank you, Skillen.